I worked with WHO for another 3 years, in both roles, mainly working on advocacy and policy for the Motor Vehicles Act, which is now passed, but which started off as more of a need or an activism sort of a thing towards safer roads and towards right to be safe on roads, etc. Which of course came down to, of course, just two or three piecemeal provisions in the act finally. But it was enriching to be a part of that experience. So I've applied for this particular course because I'm interested. I've seen how policymaking works, but I want to expand my interest and my scope much more than just transport policies, or much more than just policies looked at from the legal and legislative point of view, and more from the societal point of view. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks, Ravitej. And thank you also for directing my attention to the fact that it's already 3:15. Yeah. So the students after Ravitej, Rutu, Saubhagya, all of you, I think what you can do is put in brief introductions of yourself in the chat box. And, towards the end of the talk, there is time, then I'll definitely like come back to you all and, get to know a little bit more of you all. And it's just for me as a teacher to know where you come from, and also to sort of pitch my discussions in some ways, also knowing where you're from, especially in terms of your undergraduate training. I can see from the few introductions that I've heard so far that a lot of you come from a very diverse background, some political science, some engineers. And that's quite interesting because I do see a lot of those from the technical background sort of shifting and wanting to do public policy, especially. So that's quite an interesting turn. And of course, traditionally, political science students, there's a sort of an inclination in some ways to take public policy. Public policy is also a very in program right now. So a lot of students also tend to gravitate towards that for those reasons as well. Just give me a minute. I'll just come back one minute. Yeah. Okay. So I thought, like I said, I thought I could have a sort of a brief sort of introduction on something that some of you may be very familiar with or must have heard of in some way, which is the Right to Education Act. And I wanted to sort of focus on this because it's something that I have engaged with at the level of a scholar, something at the level of even a public practitioner and a researcher. So it's something that's close to my knowledge space. And it's also something that I like to introduce students to, especially when it's something to do with education policy. Before I start the course, sorry, not the course, sorry, the session, I just wanted to ask you all, what do you understand of terms such as, say, civil society broadly? I mean, it has a very strong political connotation, of course, in terms of definition. But what do you simply understand when I say the word, say, civil society? Uh, Anyone can answer. There are no right or wrong answers here. I'm not testing you, of course. So you could just sort of briefly tell me what is it that comes to your mind when I say civil society?
Everyone living together with shared common interest, I guess. Like,
Okay, who's speaking? I'm sorry.
ma'am, it's
Uh,
Prajakta.
okay, yeah, hi, Prajakta. Sorry, I can see a lot of raised hands, and for some reason, this has been a case for me from the last semester that the raised hands thing, I can never sort of place who it is by. Uh, so Prajakta is saying something of, say, a communitarian endeavor where
Yeah.
people have similar values and they stay together. Okay. Anybody else?
Civil society could be that part of society which does not pertain to government or private entities, something outside of those two spheres, like NGOs or religious organizations, maybe.
That's like the fairly more general answer, Jeff. Yeah, that's right. So in the sense that it's something that's connected with the non-state space, something that thought of in terms of broadly as private, but when we say private, it actually has a range of spatial differences, definitional differences, institutional differences, scope, outreach differences. So, in that way, something that we term as civil society is a very broad based, non state sort of space, very roughly defined in terms of, say, institutional actors like, say, NGOs, a range of charitable organizations, some maybe also religious organizations, and also in many ways organizations that work in, they could be religious organizations, but they're involved in some form of, for the lack of a better word, secular activities. So, for example, they would be involved in some acts of education or welfare or health or some sort of support activities that may be beyond, say, the capacity of only being associated with a religious leaning, so to say. Okay, so it's a little bit complex in that way. So I won't sort of go into those definitional attributes, but broadly, that's what it connotes. So when we say civil society broadly, at least in the education space in India, there's a very long history of civil society. Okay, and here I would like to also make some form of a distinction that when I'm talking about education here, it's called modern education. Okay, it's something that very historically comes about in the 19th century. Okay, it's education that also in India is strongly linked to a colonial interface. As all of you know, that we've been ruled, different parts of our country have been ruled by, and we also have a certain colonial history and a colonial past. The most easiest definition of that is that I'm talking in English to you and you all are answering in English to me as well. Not going into the much more complex sort of political, social, and economic dynamics of the language and what it means in higher education or in education in general because of our colonial past, I would like to state here that when we're talking about education and trajectories of access and equity, I'm categorically looking at something what's called modern education, which comes only in the 19th and 20th century within ideas of liberal education and within broader discourses of democracy, which again have a linkage to a certain enlightenment period in Europe, continental Europe. Okay, why I make this distinction is that there were a series of political and economic changes that happened in the country at that point in time that make education a very, very contested terrain for a lot of actors to act upon. Okay, so there are missionaries, there are various social reformers, there are a range of other colonial state actors as well, who are all active participants in how education policy gets shaped. Okay, so in that way, we have a very long colonial linkage. And I'd like to see that as a very separate sort of historical trajectory from a much more early modern period or even an ancient period historically, because we've had learning and knowledge as part of our cultural system for a much more longer period. Okay, so for much more longer period, we've had that as part of our system, but we must be very what you say, as critical academic scholars, open and aware of the fact that the space of education was not open to all. Okay, it was not open to all, it was not accessed by all in that period. So when we say modern education and when we talk about democracy and liberal education in the 19th and 20th century, there are a certain set of historical events that take place to make education accessible to all. And when we say all, it means that there are a variety of social categories for whom education was not traditionally accessed. Okay, women, lower castes, Adivasis, These are various intersections of social identities and social marginalizations that did not allow for access into equitable education. Okay, so when we say modern education in the 19th and 20th century, it is a certain series of events that took place that allowed for education as a pathway of aspiration, as a pathway of mobility, and as a pathway of very strong social change. Okay, so when we look at education from that lens, we must look at education very politically, socially, and also economically. Because at the end of the day, when we talk about education, one must ask a very important question here. What are the material resources available for education? Did the colonial state invest enough in education? Did the post-independent state, when we got independence in 1947, did they invest properly in education? Various levels of education, school education, higher education. What was the kind of focus that existed when governments invested in education? I open it out for a very common question that I often ask all my students when I start the course is what exactly is India spending of its GDP on education today? It's a very simple question, and I'm sure some of you would know. So, opening it out to all of you, can any one of you tell me what exactly does India spend? You can even Google it. I mean, like it's all accessible to you right there at your fingertips. Provided, I hope that you choose a credible source, okay? A credible source like World Bank data or something to look at your answer and not some random Wikipedia entry.
It should be around 6% and it's around 3% right now.
Yes, that's right, Karthik. It's about 3.8% as per World Bank data. And what you're referring to is the Kothari Commission report, which was tabled in 1960s, somewhere in the 1960s, that actually advocated that the government should spend at least 6%. Okay. And this was when? This was in the 1960s when our population was a lot more smaller. Okay. We were just post independence, and at that juncture, it was said at least 6%. We've still not met that target, okay? Although our GDP has increased substantially, and with our GDP expanding substantially, our percentage in some ways of spending has expanded, but our needs have expanded as well, which then also asks the very important question that what exactly is the equity when it comes to infrastructure, quality, and experiences of education in our system? Is it that all students who enter the education system have an even, fair, and equitable entry point, experiences, and in some ways, opportunities at the end of a certain education system? Okay, so that's something that I would really like you all to think about. I'm going to try and see if I can share my, yeah, just a minute. Sorry, it's taking a bit of a time. Okay. Can you see the PPT?
Yes, ma'am. It's visible.
Okay. Why is it? Okay, I'm not very tech savvy, but is it just showing in a really small size?
No, mom, it's on the main window. It's fine.
It's
Okay,
in full screen, ma'am.
it's in full screen. Okay, for me, it's yeah, I'm not very tech savvy, so I will, on occasion, exhibit my ignorance when it comes to technology and very simple aspects that all of you know and right at your fingertips. So I might exhibit some ignorance, but just take it as age that, I'm not very aware of it. Yeah. So yeah, I've sort of asked you all these questions already, and I'm going to now ask you the final question over here on this slide, which is, some of you may be aware of this, or maybe a lot of you would be aware of this, but when did India pass the Right to Education Act? You can Google it as well. Can anyone tell me?
2005.
2005, yeah. So that's like actually in between in terms of how the right was being sort of composed and formalized and all that. But
2009 was when
officially, like, when does the right come into like the gazette and out? I'm just
2009.
asking. Yeah, 2009-10, okay, roughly. So the thing is that with dates and figures, when it comes to history, we must understand that there are a number of processes that are happening with the right, okay, as it's getting concretized. So 2009-10, like, if someone were to ask you like a fact in a, a question somewhere, like, when did it come out? So officially it was passed in the gazette in 2009-10, and it comes out. But there's actually a very long history to the right to education in the Indian context. Okay. So some of you would ask, or I will ask you this question: why do you think that this right to education is important? It comes only about, say, a decade ago. Why do you think it's important? Or is it that before the Right to Education Act, education was not really very important in our country? Or why do you think legislatively and socio-politically the act is important in the Indian context?
Ma'am, ma'am, as you said in the beginning that India is a country where in socially a lot of sections were denied with the education. So
Mhm.
to make sure that education is accessible to all
Mhm.
in an equitable manner, it was important to make it as a legislative right for each citizen, rather than just having as a, I mean, like a uh, like just a facility in a nation. It was important to make it as a right which they can claim. And secondly, India is a country which claims to have a demographic dividend which has 65% population at a younger stage. So if you need to reap the benefits of demographic dividend, you actually need to have them skilled and educated to prevent it from becoming a demographic disaster. So those are the two reasons.
Okay. Yeah. So, good answer, Karthik, like in the sense that it captures a lot of things in some ways. So, legislatively, it's like you said, that's correct, that by making something that existed a little bit more amorphously into a right, what happens is that it allows people to claim from the government a certain accountability. Okay, so in that way, a right or something that comes within a rights framework is obviously very useful, because it asks accountability from the state. Now, when we say state in the Indian context, is it monolithic? Is it just one kind of state that exists in the Indian context? Or what do you think is the structure of the Indian state? Those from the political science backgrounds, what is the structure of the Indian state?
If I may go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So of course, I'm not going to. My answer is not obviously going to directly answer your question whether what the structure of the Indian state is. The fact is that the current Indian state, the establishment that we have received post-colonial times,
Mhm.
is has rendered to be insufficient in realizing the needs and aspirations of the people.
Okay.
So I'm looking at this. I'm looking at it from this perspective. So when you say you say that like the education act, for example, I think it was implicit as also in Article 45 of the Directive Principles of State Policy, if I'm not mistaken. But it was, and many such things of social importance are in the directive principles, without having necessarily the need to be a legislation.
Mhm.
So, and going by the concept of making this a legislation, there are many other factors that the Indian state then would like to make into a legislation. So, of course, these are just a few of the thoughts that are coming to my mind. I don't think I have answered your question, though.
Okay. Yeah. This is Ravi, right?
Yes, this is Ravite.
Ravi Teja.
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, that's, yeah, I mean, like, in some ways, I guess, when I'm saying structure here, it's a structure that also sort of predates, say, post-independence. And what I'm trying to perhaps ask of you all is that the Indian state, in terms of structure, is federal by nature, right? So there are regional states, and then there's also the central state, so to say. So education comes on the concurrent list only in the 1970s, and it comes during post-emergency. And even after it comes on the concurrent list, education is something that's governed both by the state governments and by the central government, which makes it in many ways the onus regionally to have more stake in education, but also that centrally for certain guidelines, financial, other aspects of regulation, frameworks, there is a certain onus for the regional government to also adhere to central government policies as well. This also has a certain linkage to a range of schemes and programs that come about in the 90s, like Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, district primary education project, very large scale programs that come into place where the central government and the state government want to actually tackle a range of aspects with regard to access and quality of education across the country. Okay. So I won't go there. That's a lot more specialized discussion with engages with, say, schemes and programs with regard to education policy. But what I'm trying to say here is that the federal nature of India's like structure in many ways allows it for the fact that even, and this is pre-independence, pre as well, because as you would know that a lot of states were part of, say, presidencies, princely states. Okay, so how we see them as linguistic states today post independence, there was a very different sort of arrangement in some ways even pre independence, and those colonial structures also determined education policy, and that carried on post independence as well and has influenced our policy even now. Okay, so when I'm saying federal structure, there's an unevenness with the ways in which, say, local state governments have looked at education, and the central government has also sought to engage with education. When education becomes a right, which is just only a decade ago, what it does is that it makes the state here, both the local and the central, formally accountable in many ways to its children, saying that children have to be educated from age 6 to age 14 compulsorily. Okay, see the usage of my word, compulsory. It means that these children have to be in the school system from this age to this age. It's something that the state has to account for. Before the right being in place, people did access schooling of various nature. Okay, whether it's the local primary government school or it is another kind of high school. It's not that people did not access schools, but if you look at data, you will find that India has a very stratified schooling system, exceedingly stratified schooling system, where there are a range of primary schools that might run just from class 1 to class 5, okay, because it's seen as an important part of the basic education space. Then after that, there will be a range of schools running from, say, class 6 to class 12, and then later on there is higher education. This stratified sort of uneven education space exists across the country, and if you look at data, you will see that some states have actually done better than other states, and that's because local state governments have taken a very strong initiative for a very long period of time to ensure that children get some form of basic education. So you will see differences in, say, literacy rates of, say, Kerala and Tamil Nadu, some parts of the Northeast, versus other parts of North Indian states where education still remains a little bit fractured. Okay, and that history precedes independence as well in many ways. Okay, because there's a range of social actors who influenced education as a public good in these social contexts. So when I say right to education over here, I'm trying to imply here that it is only in 2009-10 that the state finally becomes formally accountable to say that these children will remain in school and that we will ensure that the children complete a certain form of schooling from age 6 to age 14. And you must know that in 2000s that we are in right now, this level of compulsory education is definitely not enough, right? Do you think it's enough just to have schooling from age 6 to age 14?
No.
Yeah, I don't think that it is enough.
But just see that it's something that's coming so late in our country. It's coming only now to say age 6 to age 14. And if you look at data, you'll also see that it's only after the right to education gets passed that enrollment rates shoot up massively in many, many schools across the country. Okay, so before that, laws of compulsory schooling are largely governed by state governments and largely governed by municipal governments as well. Okay, so it's very locally governed in some ways that many states had certain primary compulsory laws with regard to basic education, but they were very unevenly administered. It was largely the onus of the regional state government to take a political initiative for education or not. With education coming formally as a right in 2009-10, what it does is that it makes an entire machinery of state, okay, local, central, accountable to a whole population. And it is also in many ways connected to what Karthik also says, that we are moving demographically to a certain population age where we are also sought to be productive citizens, okay, employable productive citizens. So in those connotations, education becomes a very, very important aspect in some ways. So when I'm saying here, like I've already said, modern education in terms of, say, rights, equity, self-respect, these are discussions that come about only in the 19th and 20th century. You also see a range of, say, social reformers who have very varied perspectives on education, 19th and 20th century, okay? So you will have people who are averse to the idea that children should go to school, and that's largely to the fact that lower caste children going to school meant that those who were upper caste and owned land did not have people to till the land. Okay, so if these children who were lower caste and tilled the land, they went to school, then who would till the land? Okay, so there's a lot of caste also that comes into the picture in terms of access and equity. Missionaries especially played a huge role in a lot of parts of the country to ensure that a lot of people from the lower caste got educated, and that created a lot of different kinds of social change aspects in different parts of the country. Now, post independence, what happens is that in 1947, as even what Ravi Teja indicated, that education, when it had the opportunity to say, should we make it a fundamental right, it doesn't become a right. It remains in the frame of the directive principle of state policy. What that implies is that the government or the state will, it should do it, okay? It should do it. It should ideally do it. It's a good thing for the state to do it, to be accountable, etc. But there is no legal accountability to say that it must do it. Okay, so there's a difference in the framing of the language of it being in the directive principles of state policy. Right now, can you tell me what remains in the directive principle of state policy now that education has become a fundamental right? What is it that now remains as a subset in the directive principle of state policy? Sorry, directive principles of policy. Can any of you tell me if you've been following the national education policy discussions?
If I may go ahead here, is
Yeah.
it affiliation or is it minority education institutions? It's only a question. I'm not sure.
Yeah. No, that's okay. So what I was actually going for is early childhood education. Okay, so that is still not compulsory. It's actually a directive principle. So if some of you are aware, okay, before age 6, before a child enters first standard, a lot of us go to kindergarten, preschool, etc. That space in India is one of the most privatized spaces ever. Okay, it's also a market in the sense that it is a space that is very under-regulated. It is a space that even the government cannot control very well, although the Delhi government has been trying very hard to regulate it in some ways. But it's a market and it's something that's highly expensive. Okay, so even before age 6, children are put into schools, and it makes a huge difference for how the child gets access into higher forms of learning age 6 and above. Many schools, when they actually admit children at age 6, okay, often teachers, principals very informally ask that has the child gone to preschool, even though the right mandates that such questions should not be asked, or transfer certificates, migration certificates, other documentation should not be asked, and the child should be admitted at age 6 in any government school. A lot of teachers and principals ask these questions as to, has the child been educated earlier? Has the child been in any kind of formal education situation earlier? Why do you think that question is asked?
A lot of the basic skills required in school, like such as basic writing, language, will be taught in before first standard. So the schools might be inquiring because it eases their burden of not having to teach these basic skills. So they would have to put in less effort, and it would make their overall jobs easier. So that's why they would want to know. And more often, these institutions also have their own preschools. So they might want to encourage more people to join their own preschool initiatives or schools. That's why they might be encouraging or pushing people to go over there.
Okay. Yeah. So, Jeff, you're right in that way. So, it is actually indicative of the fact that teachers and principal also want to know what exactly is the educability of this child. So you're going to admit this child. How much of work will we have to do? What kind of parental background support does the child have? Will the teacher have to put in more effort to teach a child, or is it that the child has parental support at home? These are markers of what in sociology people would call social and cultural capital. Okay, we all come with that at some level, in the sense of who our parents are, where they've been educated, what kind of opportunities we had, what kind of privileges we've had. So it's largely sociologically termed as something called social and cultural capital. It's a term that's also coined in some ways by the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. So, in many ways, being able to assess where a child has come from also, in many ways, allows for the school to be able to see whether they want to admit the child or not, although the act says that government schools are not supposed to do that. Now, the kinds of schools that Jeff is referring to are also, in many ways, a certain kind of, say, private schools. They could be low income private schools, a range of private schools that exist in our country of varying regulation management structures. Okay, so there's no one kind of private school that exists in our country. There's a variety of it. So there could be unregulated low income private schools, which mean that they don't meet RTE norms and standards. They're not particularly affiliated to any school boards correctly, or they may not even be meeting a lot of norms and standards of infrastructure, quality of teaching, in the sense that the teachers may not be qualified, etc. Then there are also high income private schools where children of elites go, which means that you pay fees and go. Then there are also residential private schools that are even more elite and of a variety of nature, that have been there for a longer period of time and have been run by a range of different management structures. So there are a variety of private schools that exist in our country, and similarly, there are a variety of government schools that exist in our country as well. So if you look at government schools itself, there's a variety of, say, municipal board, state government schools. Then there are CBSE KV schools. Then there are Navodaya Vidyalayas that are again run under the central board. Then there are international board schools that are again private and largely cater to elites. So there are a range of schools, a range of regulatory and management structures. And if you actually go deeper into understanding these regulatory and management structures, you will clearly see the stratified nature of the education system in our country. You will see who is it that's going to a municipal school, who is it who is going to a CBSE school, and who is it who is going to an IB school. Okay, so it's a very uneven terrain in terms of access and equity in our country. Even in the 2000s, when the discussion for the Right to Education Act actually happened, there was a lot of things that made the parliamentarians uncomfortable. They were like, is it that we're going to ask children and force parents to put children in schools? And a lot of the times, the discussions that came about in the minutes of the meeting were to suggest that the government would be accountable. We are not going to change the language to force parents to put children into schools. This is a very important point that I'd like all of you to keep in mind. What it tells you in many ways is that in India, the child is not a ward of the state. Okay, what does that mean? It means that the child is not directly the ward of the state. The child is a ward of the parents first and foremost. That the parents decide for the child as to whether the child will go into school or not. This is a very important distinction because in a lot of European countries, especially Nordic countries, which are social democracies, the child is a ward of the state, which means that if parents do not meet certain basic requirements of child care and general care for the child, it is the state that comes into the picture to take direct accountability of the child. Okay, so the child is a ward of the state. These linguistic definitions are very important for us to understand legal accountability in the Indian context. Moving ahead, as you know, some of these aspects have already touched upon that when we say governance, okay, so when we say governance in a mammoth, diverse country like India, there are a variety of structures over here. Okay, a policy that's enacted at a central level gets translated in very diverse ways at the local level. It's never ever translated in the same way that one expects a policy at the central level. The language of a policy that exists at that level is often translated in many multiple layers by a range of functionaries, activists, and stakeholders in very different ways for a range of different reasons. Okay. Also, please know very, very importantly that the Right to Education Act comes in a political economy scenario in India when the state is actually withdrawing from the social sector. Okay, some of you may be very familiar with the term called neoliberalization. Okay, so when I'm saying neoliberalization, what I'm implying is that there's a change in the state's responsibilities where the state will not directly be a provider for education, health, and social welfare. It will allow other actors to come into the space to take over that act, which means that a range of private actors come into that space, which then also implies that a range of regulatory frameworks have to come into place for the act to take place. Okay, so it's coming at a time when the state is actually allowing for a range of private actors to come into place. So the state is saying that it will only be a regulatory person, it's not going to be the primary provider. This political context is very important to understand because it shapes the way in which the Right to Education Act gets translated into practice. Okay, so at one level, it is saying that the state will be accountable. At another level, it is at a time when materially or financially, the state is saying that, you know, we must allow for private actors to come in and pitch the ground. I don't think the state should pitch the ground. So you can see actually a paradox in many ways politically that shapes how the act will be translated into practice. There are a lot more aspects that I'd like to sort of emphasize here, but I think that, you know, we just have another 5 to 6 minutes and I'm going to open it out for questions. Okay, so I wanted to actually look at one way in which how the policy dimension gets translated into practice, but I think that's sort of going a little bit deep. So I'm just going to open it out to questions here for the next 5 to 6 minutes and just have a little round about what is it that you understand, what kind of questions come to your head, and I'll do my best to answer them in the limited time that's available. So go ahead.
I just had a question. My question is something like neoliberalization something that could work in India? Ideally speaking, yes, governments will, apply the regulations. They'll strictly adhere to them. But ideally speaking, should our country be moving towards a neo-liberalized way of governance? I personally am opposed to it as of now, perhaps in the future, but not as of now.
Okay.
Just opening this all to everyone.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thanks, Jeff, for that observation. Anybody else? Are there any questions that come up with the presentation and what I'm trying to sort of posit here? Because it's more in terms of laying the terrain of education policy, which is very vast. And I thought I'd just introduce you to one sort of landmark act through the right to education. So any of you, any questions, any observations, anything that comes to your
Yeah.
mind?
So I had a question, like in the sense of right to education, how does that include children with disabilities in the sense like physical or mental? Because I mean, again, they're not on a fair level, like level. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I have no idea. But like the playing field is not the same for them, right? So how does that they incorporate that into the act?
Yeah, thank you, Parnika. That's a good question. So, actually speaking, the Right to Education Act actually makes a mention that at some level, the school should also take into account children of especially challenged and children with disabilities as well. But as you are also perhaps in some ways, or I am perhaps reading in your question, is that the act actually does not make anything known in terms of structures and systems provided for how will the school and how will the system actually engage with these children, and what kind of systemic support will be available to the teacher, to the students, to the parents, to actually allow for a lot more inclusive education experience for these children in a school system. Okay, so that is a very big and deep question over there, and the act as such just mentions it, but it does not go deeper really. If you look at other documents that come after the act to say, okay, how will this implementation take place, who will be the stakeholders, how will we ensure. So if you actually look at a follow-up of those processes, you will see that there is actually a big lacuna. Okay, so those things have not been thought of at all.
So like there's not even like a provision to train teachers, uh, like to teach according to special needs as well, and even in the physical infrastructure of the places, like children on wheelchairs and all, it like even the buildings are not accessible for them, like school buildings. So they haven't really thought it out at all.
Yeah, that's right, Parnika, that's right. Yeah, anybody else?
Can I go ahead?
Yeah, this is Dhruva, is it? Or
Karthik.
Karthik?
This ma'am,
Yeah,
that's
sure.
Karthik.
Yeah, go ahead, Karthik.
Ma'am, my question is with respect to the implementation of right to education.
Mhm.
The question is quality and access.
Mhm.
Ma'am, when we talk about right to education, we have given our citizens the right, but they have two choices, either to go for the government schools or for the private schools.
Mhm.
When it comes to a government school, yes, they do have the access, but there the quality is compromised. And when it comes to private schools, they have the quality, but then the accessibility to the mass is a big question with because the fees there is beyond reach of a large number of people.
Mhm.
So how far is this right actually implementable on ground, or how far has this been a success?
So, Karthik, in terms of a lot of the research studies that have looked at implementation of various aspects of the act, it's been very uneven. Okay, so it's not in some states, a lot of local government structures have been uh, concretized and things have moved a little bit better, but in other states it hasn't been the case very well, and a lot of reports that have studied the implementation aspects of the Right to Education Act suggest that the government itself, who is claiming and saying that they'll be accountable, has actually not in many ways released funds, released resources to even ensure that a lot of aspects of infrastructure and quality in terms of training of teachers, etc., has happened. Okay, so at one level, even in something like the government schooling, which is again very diverse and varied across the country, okay, it's also diverse and varied in the sense that in many states, okay, there will be primary schools up to class 5, and if you look at dropout rates, you will see that dropout rates actually increase by puberty and 6 7 standard, especially amongst women, and schools where there are no toilets, etc. You will see 6 7 standard dropout rates increasing at multiple levels because the government itself has not provided a school in vicinity to cover for upper primary schooling. And there are a range of private actors that have started schools in the upper primary and the secondary stratum, which is also inaccessible to a lot of the students. Okay, so it's very stratified, it's very uneven. In some places, there is a clear sort of cycle that connects the primary, upper primary, secondary. In a lot of places, the system is so stratified that it's very uneven. And a lot of the reports on the implementation of RTE itself suggest that the government itself has not been able to meet its own norms and standards that it has specified in the Act. That's one. At the other level, when you're talking about private schools, see there, like I noted earlier, there's a wide diversity in private schools, okay? But the Act also has something that is called Section 12(1)(c), where it's actually trying to say that 25% of students will be in private schools, and these are economically weaker section students who can apply to get admission in private schools. And that's something that I wanted to actually discuss a little bit more, but I don't really have the time and space here. And maybe if you wait for a year and you come to my course, we can have that discussion in more detail. But the thing is that it is the RTE, something that I did not mention, it also seeks to impose frameworks of norms and standards on private schools as well. It is seeking to say that there are a range and diversity of private schools, and they also need to have some forms of norms and standards. And this is very important because it links to the experience and quality of education as well. You can't have a school where there isn't space for a playground. You can't have a school where the children are just sitting, cooped up in class and only doing studies. So the idea of education has to be a little bit more holistic. So that is one of the reasons why these norms and standards have been detailed in some ways. But at the same time, the idea of norms and standards is also very difficult to generalize in a very diverse country like India as well. Okay, so I'm going to sort of stop the discussion here because it's around 4 o'clock. But I also have another meeting, but I'll just take one more question or one more observation. So Prajakta, maybe you can sort of go ahead.
Thank you,
Ma'am, while we're discussing about government providing us with correct facilities or not, ma'am, actually my mother, she's a teacher in government school, so sometimes they have to go out and look for students so that they can admit them in their school. So sometimes parents are also quite reluctant to send their send their children to school. So how will we tackle that if students are only reluctant to come into schools? So first of all, that is the main problem that we'll have to sort of take into account rather than discussing if governments are providing proper schooling or not, because there quite a lot of time it's parents there who are reluctant to send their kids to school.
That's actually a very complex discussion, Prajakta, in terms of how we understand why parents are not willing to send their children to school. It's also in terms of many ways, what they think the experience of the child will be in a government school. Okay, because they're also seeing how children in government schools perhaps are not being treated in certain ways. And when I'm saying this, I don't want to make a generalization here and say that all government schools are the same and all government schools provide experiences only in some ways. But the socio-geographic location of a particular school and the kind of amenities, facilities, and resources it provides, and the aspirations that families have with regard to education are shaped very locally in many ways. Okay, so why or certain students seek to still go to government schools versus other students who don't want to go to government schools is something that needs to be actually addressed in a much more sort of a larger comparative way, where we must take into account a range of socio-geographical like categories as well, to see why is it that they're going or they're not going. Okay, it also differs by, say, rural urban geographies as well. And it also in many ways is dependent on how, say, state governments have the political will to shape public education in some ways. Okay, so you will see a very different discussion in, say, states like Kerala, Tamil Nadu versus states like Gujarat versus states like Madhya Pradesh versus states like Bihar, Rajasthan. Okay, you will see very different discussions even in Delhi. Okay, where there have been a range of reforms in the past couple of years where the state is trying to say that, listen, we have to be accountable to the students. We need to make government schools better. So there are a range of factors actually that determine why is it that children choose to go to government schools or not, or why is it that they prefer to go to private schools or not. Parental discretion, of course, is an important aspect, like I said, because parents are the fundamental decision makers when it comes to children in our country. But there are a range of reasons and there's a diversity here. So at some level, it's also very difficult to generalize and say why that happens. But in many ways, studies have indicated that parents also, in some ways, have an idea of what is it that the child is going to experience in that school system. Okay, so I'll stop here for now. It's about 4:05. Thank you so much for coming for this session. And I hope that I have in some ways engaged you all in an area that's something that I work on. And I hope to see you all next year for the education policy course that I will be taking. So thank you all and good day.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Bye. Good day. Yeah.
Good day.